Everything is a remix. This is my thesis, stated somewhat more modestly. The creative technique shares many important properties with the remix. It's not as catchy, it doesn't roll off the tongue in quite the same way. I'm sure you can see why I went with the former. This is primarily a video series that I started in September of 2010. I wrapped it up this year in February. And here's how I stated my premise back then in 2010. Remix. To combine or edit existing materials to produce something new. The term remix originally applied to music. It rose to prominence late last century during the heyday of hip-hop, the first popular music form to incorporate sampling from existing recordings. Early example, the Sugar Hill Gang samples the bass riff from Chic's Good Times in the 1979 hit Rapper's Delight.
Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat. And me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet. These are the good times.
Since then, that same bass line has been sampled dozens of times.
What a scene, pulling up with Jodeci, blasting up a 15. I got the good life, no stripe, real nice. And I'm a papa, my son Trey, haha.
Eu sou velho caderninho de telefone, com o nome e o número de monte de mulher. E ele vai ligar.
Skip ahead to the present and anybody can remix anything, music, video, photos, whatever, and distribute it globally pretty much instantly. You don't need expensive tools, you don't need a distributor, you don't even need skills. Remixing is a folk art, anybody can do it. Yet these techniques, collecting material, combining it, transforming it, are the same ones used at any level of creation. You could even say that everything is a remix. All right. So with a remix, you're creating new media out of old media. So you take existing songs, let's say, you chop them up, you combine them together, you transform those pieces to make it all fit, and you've got a new song, but that new song is clearly comprised of old songs. So remix could be thought of as the arrangement and transformation of samples. But I think remix is a good metaphor for any kind of creation. So copying materials, transforming them, combining them, it's kind of the basic elements of any type of creativity. I don't think this is a scary idea. I don't think it's a depressing idea. I think it's empowering, and I think it's a better way to conceive of creativity. Now, this notion that we are building our new works out of old works runs in opposition to the popular mythology that we have about creativity. We have myths of creativity. We have stories, and they're good stories, and they served us well for a long time, but I think they lead us astray in important ways. Touched by the hand of God. This is how creativity has been conceived of for most of human history. So human beings weren't in themselves powerful enough to actually create anything new. All a human could do was channel God, channel nature, channel the beauty of God. And we still sort of have remnants of this idea now. Not that we think creativity is divine necessarily, but we conceive of it as sort of a mysterious thing. So we use words like gifted and talented and genius to suggest that it's sort of an ability that comes from elsewhere, and either you've got it or you don't. A couple hundred years, the Romantics came along. Beethoven was kind of the early prototype. Romantics went, completely the opposite direction with it. They said, these creations are ours. They're unique expressions of our inner selves. I'm not channeling anybody. It is completely me. And again, we still sort of, we're stuck with the remnants of this idea as well. We like this idea of the soul inventor, kind of the rugged individualist who creates from within himself, kind of seemingly without influence. Light bulb, I believe I'm actually obligated to show a light bulb when I talk about creativity in slides. I think you have to show it, so there it is. I ticked my box, it's done. This is our most popular visual metaphor for an idea. So of course, it's an important invention by Thomas Edison, popularized by Thomas Edison, but it also tells us something about how creativity happens. It tells us that ideas happen fast, like flipping a switch, that they come out of nowhere. Bam, darkness, light, happens fast. When the reality behind most creations is it's kind of a chaotic affair, very sprawling, and a lot of the cute stories, the cute, catchy stories that we hear afterwards about how it happened, they're just that. They're cute stories. They're very stylized. They don't really depict the messiness and chaos of what actually happened. Les Demoiselles d'Avion, famous painting by Pablo Picasso. This is still sort of like the gold standard for creativity. So nothing like this had been seen at the time. But it was in many ways a composite of works that existed out there. So it was influenced by, the shapes of the faces was influenced by African art, what was called primitive art at the time. It wasn't primitive, it was just African. They didn't dig these things up, people were making them. It was influenced by classical sculpture. A lot of classical sculptures were really tall, 12 feet high or bigger. So when Picasso was looking up at these, the lower parts of the body, the proportions would, get smaller as you go up the thing. So the feet and the hands would look really big, and that influenced the shapes of the bodies here. And then a lot of the actual, painting techniques were, of course, influenced by his contemporaries. So even somebody like Picasso, very much conceived of his work, using the materials that were available to him at the time. So using existing media to create new media hit the mainstream with Danger Mouse, with the Grey Album, which was a mashup of the Black Album, Jay-Z's Black Album, and the Beatles' White Album, which was just begging to happen in retrospect. And this was sort of the ultimate realization of remix technique. This was new media that was made from nothing but old media. So as opposed to in conventional hip hop, where at least you've got an original rap vocal at least, you've got maybe some drum machines, some synthesizers. There is some new stuff in there. This was new music made from nothing but old music. So when we think of remix, we frequently think of the mashup. But the technique has been around, as far back as you care to look. It's just it required technical skill to actually copy things. You had to know how to play an instrument or paint or whatever to actually, copy things accurately. So this earlier manual process of remixing is where I wanted to start my story. So I began it with a breakdown of where some of Led Zeppelin's early songs came from. They did a lot of mashing up of different lyrics and riffs and melodies from other artists, and did it without attribution, unfortunately. So here's a clip from part 1 about Led Zeppelin.
The opening and closing sections of Bringin' On Home are lifted from a tune by Willie Dixon entitled, not coincidentally, Bringin' On Home.
Got my ticket, got that load. I done bought my ticket, I got my load.
The Lemon Song lifts numerous lyrics from Howlin' Wolf's Killin' Floor.
I should have quit you long time ago. I should have quit you a long time ago.
Black Mountainside lifts its melody from Black Waterside, a traditional arranged by Bert Jansch. Dazed and Confused features different lyrics but is clearly an uncredited cover of the same titled song by Jake Holmes. Oddly enough, Holmes filed suit over 40 years later in 2010.
Been dazed and confused for so long, it's not true.
I'm dazed and confused, hanging on by a thread.
And the big one, Stairway to Heaven, pulls its opening from Spirit's Taurus. Zeppelin toured with Spirit in 1968, 3 years before Stairway was released.
Okay, so what distinguished what Zeppelin was doing from what other people were doing? Lots of people were doing other people's songs. Attribution and success is what distinguishes Zeppelin from everybody else. Lots of young artists, especially in this era, young British blues-based bands, they were doing covers of very old songs most of the time. But they were saying, this is somebody else's song. They were attributing the songwriting credit to somebody else. So Zeppelin broke that tradition. There was a cultural tradition of that, and also copyright law to back it up. And success distinguished Zeppelin. Again, there were people doing sort of what they did, except they didn't get hits, so nobody really cared. So there's sort of this two-way cycle that can happen, where the artist who is copying from somebody else elevates the value of what that person originally did, assuming it was obscure. So it's sort of a two-way thing. It's not just a ripping off. It's that the new artist has actually elevated the value of work that already existed. Now, Zeppelin in time became successful enough that they went from the copier to the copied. And here's a bit of what happened there. was actually, much more derivative work than this that was happening at the same time. So this is a band called Kingdom Come. They were a German heavy metal band from the 80s. The fellow on the left here actually kind of looks like Robert Plant, except his jeans aren't tight enough, but same gist. Kingdom Come were derisively referred to as Kingdom Clone. They were a pretty flagrant ripoff of Led Zeppelin. So here's a bit of their minor hit, Get It On. Okay, so that's the riff. It sounds kind of like Black Dog. Same gist. Here's the verse. Sorry, chorus. Sorry, verse. And that's kind of like Kashmir, Zeppelin.
Let the sun beat down upon my face. Stars fill my dreams.
So I'm not saying that these things are identical. I'm saying it's plainly the structure, the mood. It's plainly derivative of Led Zeppelin. I think if you played "Get It On" an electric guitar by yourself, it would sound like some sort of obscure Zeppelin song that you can't quite place. But it's a knockoff. It's staying within the confines of copyright law, but is plainly derivative of somebody else. Far more so than those songs that use actual samples from Led Zeppelin or recreations of sounds by Zeppelin. And this sort of thing is mostly what popular culture is. It's mostly, recreations, reinventions of old stuff. Audiences have a high appetite for familiar and comfortable things, and this manifests in two ways. So we get derivative stuff, and we get new versions of old stuff. So derivative stuff, we get things like genre movies. We get superhero films or horror films with creepy little kids in them, or CGI films with talking animals or other things that shouldn't talk or whatever. A lot of these films that are very interchangeable in their parts. And then we get new versions of old stuff. We get things like sequels and remakes and adaptations, legal, licensed, new versions of old stuff. Something that was successful before, you take it out and you give it another run. So this is really prevalent in film because movies are so expensive, they're so risky. You want to do something trustworthy, something that has proven itself in the past. So here's another clip. This is from part 2 about how that happens in Hollywood.
At this point, we've got 3 sequels to a film adapted from a theme park attraction. We've got a movie musical based on a musical which was based on a movie. We've got 2 sequels to a film that was adapted from an animated TV show based on a line of toys. We've got a movie based on 2 books, one of which was based on a blog, which was inspired by the other book that was adapted into the film.
Julie and Julia.
Do you follow? We've got 11 Star Trek films, 12 Friday the 13th, and 23 James Bonds. We've got stories that have been told, retold, transformed, referenced, and subverted since the dawn of cinema. We've seen vampires morph from hideous monsters to caped bedroom invaders, to campy jokes, to sexy hunks, to sexier hunks. Of the few box office hits that aren't sequels, remakes, or adaptations, the word original wouldn't spring to mind to describe them. These are genre movies, and they stick to pretty standard templates. Genres then break up into subgenres with their own, even more specific conventions. So within the category of horror films, we have subgenres like slasher, zombie, creature feature, and of course, torture porn. All have standard elements that are appropriated, transformed, and subverted. Let's use the biggest film of the decade as an example. Now, it's not a sequel, remake, or adaptation, but it is a genre film, sci-fi, and most tellingly, it's a member of a tiny subgenre where sympathetic white people feel bad about all the murder, pillaging, and annihilation being done on their behalf. I call this subgenre Sorry About Colonialism. I'm talking about movies like Dances with Wolves, The Last Samurai, The Last of the Mohicans, Dune, Lawrence of Arabia, A Man Called Horse, and even Ferngully and Pocahontas.
So you see remixed-like technique in a lot of uninspiring ways, in a lot of fairly cynical ways. But it's present in all work, the good, the bad, the revolutionary, the highly original, whatever. For me, creativity is these 3 techniques. It's copy, transform, and combine. Those are the three tools that you've got. In my opinion, anything that you can come up with, any technique you can come up with, fits into one of these three categories. So let's get into the first one. Copy. In order to create for a culture, to communicate with it, you need to speak its language. And you learn to speak a language by talking just like everybody else talks. So you don't take the words and kind of do your own thing with them. You're copying everybody. You're trying to speak just like they speak. So you learn through copying. And you especially see this in the early careers of artists. You can see artists, plainly aping the people who influence them the most. So Richard Pryor, for instance, Richard Pryor was a highly influential stand-up comic in the 1970s. He introduced topics like race and sex, drug abuse, just stuff from his life into the realm of stand-up comedy, which was fairly, a fairly narrow realm for the most part before that. So, highly original, highly influential. A lot of comics after him were like him. But when he started out, he was basically kind of doing a bad knockoff of Bill Cosby. If you watch Richard Pryor's early stuff, he sounds like not even a good version of Bill Cosby, a very, second-rate copy of Bill Cosby. But that was how he worked out his technique, and then he added his own voice to it later. Hunter S. Thompson invented gonzo journalism, so added the first-person novelistic voice to journalism and acknowledged that journalism is stories, it is a single person's view. But before he did that, he was a straight journalist, and in his spare time, he actually sat down and retyped existing books. So he sat down and he retyped F. Scott Fitzgerald, Great Gatsby, and A Farewell to Arms, Ernest Hemingway, sat down and just, word for word, typed them out. Just to, he thought it gave him the feel of writing a great novel. Bob Dylan was an especially prolific copier in his early career. It's been estimated that 2/3 of the melodies Dylan used in his early songs were borrowed. And that sort of thing is pretty typical in that realm, in the folk realm, the genre that he emerged in. These are the words of his idol, Woody Guthrie. The words are the important thing. Don't worry about tunes. Take a tune. Sing high when they sing low. Sing fast when they sing slow, and you've got a new tune. We don't know. This is kind of a secondhand quote. We don't know exactly where this came from, but it seems to convey something about the spirit of folk. When you're a folk musician, you are pulling your songs from the history that came before you, and that's what you aspire to. You aspire to add something to the lineage of folk. It means you've contributed something at that point. The goal is actually to ultimately get copied. Okay, so, and here's an example of this. You know this song, right? This land is your land, right? But it's actually not. Guthrie knocked this off. That's exactly the melody of This Land Is Your Land, but that's a very old song called When the World's on Fire. It's old. We don't know exactly where it came from. But he, took that tune and just added new lyrics to it. It was simple as that. So after we've grounded ourselves in the fundamentals through copying, it's then possible to create something new through transformation. So taking existing work and creating variations, creating iterations. This is really time-consuming tinkering, but if you do enough of it, you can produce a breakthrough. So James Watt created a major improvement to the steam engine because he was assigned to repair a Thomas Newcomen steam engine. So the Thomas Newcomen steam engine, after a short period of operation, it would gradually grind to a halt and stop working. So he was assigned to fix that, to come up with something new. Typewriter, this one's really interesting because typewriters were commonly referred to as literary pianos when they first appeared, which was just a lovely phrase. I wish we still used that. But it was the only thing, it was the only, hook that people had to conceive of it. It was something that you did this with. That's how you get ideas into it, with your fingers. So they were called literary pianos. And Christopher Latham Scholes, he actually based his version on the piano. He started with that as a template, started messing around with it, and what he ultimately came up with was the QWERTY keyboard, which we've all still got on our gadgets now. I'm not saying that QWERTY is better. Some nerds object to that. But it's better adapted. It won. It proliferated. From an evolutionary standpoint, QWERTY definitely won. So 5 years it took Christopher Latham Scholes to come up with the QWERTY keyboard layout. Thomas Edison, the man, again. Thomas Edison, of course, did not invent the light bulb. That's not actually a controversial statement. There were incandescent lamps that existed before that. His was an improvement to an existing design, and that was the name of his patent. It was called an improvement in electric lamps. It wasn't called the electric lamp. He didn't come up with it out of nowhere. It was an improvement to an existing design. And he famously tried 6,000 different materials for the filament for his design, him and his team. Thomas Edison wasn't just one guy. Now, just as commonly, you can see artists and entertainers merging their influences into their work and transforming them, and often in pretty unsubtle ways. So here's how George Lucas did just this in the film Star Wars.
Even now, Star Wars endures as a work of impressive imagination, but many of its individual components are as recognizable as the samples in a remix. The foundation for Star Wars comes from Joseph Campbell. He popularized the structures of myth in his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Star Wars follows the outline of the monomyth, which consists of stages like the Call to Adventure, Supernatural Aid, the Belly of the Whale, the Road of Trials, the Meeting with the Goddess, and a bunch more. Also huge influences were the Flash Gordon serials from the 30s and Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. Star Wars plays much like an updated version of Flash Gordon, right down to the soft wipes and the opening titles design. From Kurosawa, we get masters of spiritual martial arts, a low-ranking bickering duo, more soft wipes, a beneath the floorboards hideaway, and a boastful baddie getting his arm chopped off.
You just watch yourself. We're wanted men. I have the death sentence on 12 systems.
War films and westerns were also huge sources for Star Wars. The scene where Luke discovers his slaughtered family resembles this scene from The Searchers. And the scene where Han Solo shoots Greedo resembles this scene from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The climactic airstrikes in the Dam Busters, 633 Squadron, and the bridges at Toko-Ri play very similarly to the run in the Death Star. And in many cases, existing shots were even used as templates for Star Wars special effects. There's also many other elements clearly derived from various films. We have a tin man like the Tin Woman in Metropolis, a couple shots inspired by 2001, a grab the girl and swing scene like this one in The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, a holographic projection kind of like the one in Forbidden Planet, a rally resembling this one in Triumph of the Will, and cute little robots much like those in Silent Running.
Okay, so these transformative types of creations, steam engines, typewriters, light bulbs, they aren't original ideas so much as tipping points in a continuous line of invention by a lot of different people. So the most dramatic results can happen with combinations. Business people would refer to these sorts of things, sorts of inventions as disruptive innovation. By connecting ideas together, especially when they don't seem to be related, that can be a source of potentially radical innovation. Henry Ford, for instance, and the Ford Motor Company didn't invent the assembly line, they didn't invent interchangeable parts, they didn't even invent the automobile itself. They merged all these elements together in 1908 to create the first mass-market car, the Model T. The printing press. This one is really interesting because all these components were, not just old, but ancient. They had been around for, in some cases, thousands of years. They've been around a really long time. So movable type, paper, ink, all that stuff was old. Chinese or Roman, really old. The inspired element is the screw press. It's what this guy is cranking on. And the reason this was inspired was because it was a technology that had nothing to do with printing. It was used in food production. You would, press oil or wine with a screw press. So he took a technology from a completely unrelated field and merged it into printing technology. At last, I'm in a room where everybody knows who Tim Berners-Lee is. This is a first. It's a crying shame, but people don't know who this guy is generally. Invented the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web, of course, was built on top of the internet, which itself is sort of the ultimate combination technology. It's a network of networks. It's a bunch of open protocols that all manage to speak together.
And one of the great innovations that, that Berners-Lee added was simple hypertext, the modest hyperlink. That was one of the great innovations of the web. And he didn't have to invent it. He didn't have to invent hypertext. It was out there. There were conventions about hypertext. It was like this nerdy technology that didn't have an application. It was like a solution that didn't have a problem yet. It didn't have an application. So Berners-Lee, found a problem to solve with hypertext. And then, of course, released his technology, not with just a minimal license, like an open source sort of license, but no license, like public domain, just released it into the wild. So in technology especially, we see this a lot because you can't create anything of any kind of sophistication from the ground up. It's just there's too many specialized areas of knowledge. You're not going to be able to, create every component of whatever it is you're going to make. You've got to merge stuff together. It's too technically demanding to create something from the ground up. And this applies to everybody, even great innovators like Apple. And this next clip is from part 3, shows how Apple built on top of the innovations of Xerox in the late 70s and the early 80s.
Eventually, Apple got a load of the Alto and later released not one, but 2 computers with graphical interfaces, the Lisa and its more successful follow-up, the Macintosh. The Alto was never a commercial product, but Xerox did release a system based on it in 1981, the Star 8010. 2 years before the Lisa, 3 years before the Mac. It was the Star and the Alto that served as the foundation for the Macintosh. The Xerox Star used a desktop metaphor with icons for documents and folders. It had a pointer, scroll bars, and pop-up menus. These were huge innovations, and the Mac copied every one of them. But it was the first combination it incorporated that set the Mac on a path towards long-term success. Apple aimed to merge the computer with the household appliance. The Mac was to be a simple device, like a TV or a stereo. This was unlike the Star, which was intended for professional use, and vastly different from the cumbersome command-based systems that dominated the era. The Mac was for the home, and this produced a cascade of transformations. Firstly, Apple removed one of the buttons on the mouse to make its novel pointing device less confusing. Then they added the double click for opening files. The Star used a separate key to open files. The Mac also let you drag icons around and move and resize windows. The Star didn't have drag and drop. You moved and copied files by selecting an icon, pressing a key, then clicking a location. And you resized windows with a menu. The Star and the Alto both featured pop-up menus, but because the location of these would move around the screen, the user had to continually reorient. The Mac introduced the menu bar, which stayed in the same place no matter what you were doing. And the Mac added the trash can to make deleting files more intuitive and less nerve-wracking. And lastly, through compromise and clever engineering, Apple managed to pare the Mac's price down to $2,500. Still pretty expensive, but much cheaper than the $10,000 Lisa or the $17,000 Star. But what started it all was the graphical interface merged with the idea of the computer as household appliance. The Mac is a demonstration of the explosive potential of combinations. The Star and the Alto, on the other hand, are the products of years of elite research and development. They're a testament to the slow power of transformation. But of course, they too contain the work of others. The Alto and the Star are evolutionary branches that lead back to the NLS system, which introduced Windows and the mouse, to Sketchpad, the first interactive drawing application, and even back to the Memex, a concept resembling the modern PC decades before it was possible.
Okay, so these are the basic elements of creativity: copy, transform, and combine. And with this process being so prevalent, we get plenty of redundancy. It's not people intentionally copying, it's people coming up with the same solutions because those elements have become available. Henry Ford once said, "I invented nothing new. I simply assembled the discoveries of other men behind whom were centuries of work. Progress happens when all the factors that make for it are ready, and then it is inevitable." That's why something called multiple discovery is so common. This is when inventions appear at the same time from different people, entirely unrelated, from different places around the globe. So once the components are in place, then the innovation is, in some regards, waiting to be discovered. Here's a clip from part 3 about multiple discovery.
what if Xerox never decided to pursue the graphical interface? Or Thomas Edison found a different trade? What if Tim Berners-Lee never got the funding to develop the World Wide Web? Would our world be different? Would we be further behind? History seems to tell us things wouldn't be so different. Whenever there's a major breakthrough, there's usually others on the same path. Maybe a bit behind, maybe not behind at all. Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz both invented calculus around 1684. Charles Darwin proposed the theory of evolution by natural selection, but Alfred Russel Wallace had pretty much the same idea at pretty much the same time. And Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray filed patents for the telephone on the same day. We call this multiple discovery, the same innovation emerging from different places. Science and invention is riddled with it, but it can also happen in the arts. In film, for instance, we had 3 Coco Chanel movies released within 9 months of each other. Around 1999, we had a quartet of sci-fi movies about artificial reality. Even Charlie Kaufman's unusually original film, Synecdoche, New York, bears an uncanny resemblance to Tom McCarthy's novel, Remainder. Both are the stories of men who suddenly become wealthy and start recreating moments of their lives, even going so far as to recreate the recreations. And actually, the video you're watching, was written just before The New Yorker published a Malcolm Gladwell story about Apple, Xerox, and the nature of innovation. We're all building with the same materials. Sometimes by coincidence we get similar results, but sometimes innovations just seem inevitable.
Ideas contain ideas. That is how ideas are built. That's how they evolve. We build our new ideas out of old ideas. If you look closely enough, all works contain other people's works. Famous blues singer, Blind Willie McTell, once said, "I jump them from other writers, but I arrange them my own way." And I think this is mostly what we do. We jump them from others, we arrange them our own way. Our creativity originates from without, not from within. We are social creatures, and I don't think this means that individual contributions don't matter. Of course they do. We are individuals. That's all we are, is a collection of individuals. But I think that we draw from our culture in a much bigger way than our culture admits. We are not self-made. We are dependent on one another. And I think this is a liberation from notions of gifts and talent and genius. I think the idea that everything that is a remix shows that it's easy to start, to just get in there, to make a little remix video, to throw something together, put it up there, and start flexing your muscles. It'll be very primitive. It won't be much of anything, but you can start. And if you keep pushing these techniques, there's no telling how far they can take you. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.